Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the world of Frida Kahlo. We're going to take a tour and a preview of the exhibition, which we all hope to see, which will be available at the DeYoung Museum in San Francisco. Originally, of course, it was supposed to be on all this spring, but of course, everybody, including the museum, is sheltering in place. But meantime, the museum's exhibition will be extended until the end of October. So hopefully we'll all get to see Frida Kahlo in person, her whole life. And it's a very special focus on the art and the life of Frida Kahlo. We'll have more to say about that in a few moments. But I first wanted to take a few moments to introduce myself, since we have not met before. My name is Josephine Withers, and my career path has been art history. I taught art history at the University of Maryland for more than 30 years. That's located just outside of Washington, D.C. And indeed, I lived in Washington, D.C. for many years and then moved to suburban Maryland. And then sometime after I retired, which was in 2003, I got an idea that I really wanted to move west. And so in 2013, I sold my house and practically everything in it, got in a car with a friend and my dog Tango, and moved to the Bay Area. And I've been living in Oakland since 2013. So even though I am officially retired, or as I like to say, I graduated from the university in 2003, I enjoy continuing in my own way of offering my knowledge and my interest in art to communities like yourself. So I'm delighted to be with you today. So let's start. And I will now bring our screen in. And give me a moment to get to my title page here. And do a few little adjustments here. So the title of the exhibition is Frida Kahlo, Appearances Can Be Deceiving. And we'll have something to say about that. So this is a preview of the exhibition at the DeYoung Museum. And you're looking here at a double self-portrait that she did in the 1940s. I should say that Frida Kahlo was born in 1907. So that gives you an idea. She was in her late 30s, early 40s when she painted this very beautiful painting. And we'll talk at length about that a little bit later on. So that subtitle is very provocative. Why is that subtitle saying appearances can be deceiving? Well, really, Frida constructed an identity. That is to say, a persona that she offered to her public. And one of the things that you will see in the exhibition is a whole selection of her clothing. And you can see from this picture that her clothing was extremely distinctive and almost always featured long skirts, long full skirts, and then very interesting variety of tops. The one that you see in the foreground is based on a type of dress known to the Tehuantepec Indians in the southern part of Mexico, in the state of Oaxaca. The top that you see on the left there looks a little bit more Victorian, doesn't it? But the garments are very loose, and particularly the long full skirts are very important to the kind of clothing that she typically wore throughout her adult life. And I'll show you another example of that here with these beautiful embroidered tops here, and sometimes sort of a collaged and embroidered a top. And then on the right there is a rebozo, which is a traditional kind of shawl worn by indigenous peoples in Mexico. And on the right, the picture on the right brings together not only the traditional kind of top that she was fond of wearing, but also the extraordinary hairdos that she took great care in doing herself, as well as the makeup. She loved Revlon, the jewelry, and she's holding in her hand a Mexican artifact, probably Aztec, and I'll have more to say about that too. But that both she and her husband Diego Rivera were avid collectors of ancient Mexican art. So there in a nutshell, you see some of the interests that she had in the way that she created this certain identity or persona. So the question behind the question, appearances can be deceiving. So why did she feel the need to deceive? What was the deception? Well, there's quite a story there too. On the left screen, you see this family picture with her parents in the middle of her mother there and her sisters and brothers. Surprisingly enough, though, Frida is the figure on the left, dressed in a man's outfit. This was probably maybe when she was a late teenager, maybe early 20s when this picture was taken. And so she's kind of having fun with the camera in deciding to cross-dress. So that was already sort of in her bones, in her blood, to really to fool the eye a little bit. I want you to take a closer look and notice that her right leg, which is on our left, is bent, so that it's her left leg that is weight bearing. She had polio as a child, and so she was weakened on that side of her body, particularly her leg. And that caused problems for her throughout her life, which were compounded by other medical interventions that she had a little bit later on. So this shows you one aspect of her love of deception. And then on the right is a self-portrait that she painted many years later in the 1940s, where she is dressed as a Tijuana woman with this extraordinarily elaborate headdress and completely a costume which completely disguises and covers her body in such a way that you can't even see the body underneath. Well, we still don't quite know why the deception. The mysteries will be revealed. In addition to having polio, which somewhat disabled her, she had a terrible accident in her 20s. She's about 25. And you see in this watercolor that she did herself on the left-hand screen, summing it up as if she were reporting the accident. You see her in a blue dress, stretched across the rails there. She was in that bus that you see here, and the trolley that you see on the right rammed into the bus, and she was thrown out. It's a wonder that she even survived and lived. And out of that, her pelvis was crushed, and she had further injuries, not surprisingly, to her legs and other parts of her body. And it took a long, long recuperation after that in order to put herself back together again. However, she did experience pain most of the rest of her life. And the self-portrait that you see on the right here really sums it up. This again was done in the 40s, 1944 to be exact. And you can see that this harness-like affair, which is like a girdle that she wore to support her spine, to keep it aligned and to reduce the amount of pain. But she refers to the self-portrait as the broken column. And you can see she's using a classical column there to suggest the brokenness of it. And then the pain is expressed through these nails that prick her all different parts of her body. The fact that her pelvis was so broken as a result of the accident also meant that she was never able to carry a child to term. And this was one of the big tragedies of her life. I'll come back to talk fuller about this painting at a later time, but this is to say that she is representing this stillborn fetus floating up in the air, presumably going to heaven, with blood coming out of her womb there on this hospital bed. She tried many times to conceive and to have a child by Diego Rivera. And she had many abortions as well as other miscarriages and stillbirths that never came to term. So that was one of the long-term effects of this terrible bus accident. Things got worse as she grew older. And in 1951, she died in 1954. In 1951, that right leg of hers, which was going worse, getting worse and worse, had to be amputated at the knee in order to save the rest of her. And gangrene had set in, and you will see this prosthetic device in the exhibition. And mind you, dress her to the nth. Look at that shoe. It's a beautiful, beautiful boot. Actually, she'd had these boots made specially in Chinatown when she visited San Francisco. And she wore them on her real leg, but then had it transferred and worked over when she had to have her leg amputated. And on the right is a watercolor sketch that she did. You can see 1953 was the sketch, the year before she died. And you can imagine this is almost as a little statue on a pedestal here, representing her own feet, cut off at the ankle, because it was the foot, that right foot, that was becoming gangrenous. And in another way of expressing the deadness of this limb, she has these dead vines sprouting out of the top of this little statuette. Very expressive. Well, her costuming did not end with these beautiful clothes that she had made. She also had to, as we mentioned earlier, also had to wear various kinds of girdles and other types of corsets to help her align the spine. And so one of these would have been plaster casts, which she would wear. And you can see that she didn't just leave it as a plaster cast. You see on the left her painting it as she's wearing it. Here she's using a mirror in order to better see her own chest. You'll see this in the exhibition where she has a beautifully, beautifully decorated one. And this is yet another one with what was for her a very important emblem, that is to say, the hammer and sickle. She was a devoted communist, as was Diego Rivera. And so she included that symbol very proudly right near her heart space. What you're looking at here it will also be in the exhibition, where she has layers upon layers of these beautiful clothing, which completely covers her, her feminine shape. And as if to make it really explicit, you see in the drawing on the right-hand side, almost you're seeing her as if it were X-ray vision through to the body with the, what we must take, that broken column again, right there, and what must be some kind of, another kind of brace or girdle to keep her spine, her broken spine aligned. So it took a lot of work on her part to carry out this quote unquote deception that is part of the title of this exhibition. So now we're going to look at another way in which she created a persona. Frida was fond of saying, there have been 2 accidents in my life, the bus accident and Diego. And of course, I think you all know who Diego is, not only in her life, but who he was as a celebrity. He was one of the 3 very well-known mural painters who really created a whole new phase of art in revolutionary Mexico. He was a good deal older than Frida Kahlo. He was 21 years older than she. And just for Frida to say that Diego was an accident is, of course, a little bit of an overstatement, in the sense that she was the one who really pursued Diego Rivera. He was already married, had children by another woman and so forth, but she was very persistent, and when all was said and done, they fell in love, and he got a divorce, and they got married. And it was an extremely very tumultuous, passionate, anger-filled marriage, which lasted until she died, even though there was a divorce in there sort of along the way. And I'm showing you one of her early double portraits with herself and Diego. Of course, a very large as well as portly man. And she is presenting herself as the meek little wife. She's not showing herself as an artist or a painter, which is quite different than some of her later self-portraits. And I want to say a little bit more about that in just a moment, but here on the right is a photograph much later in their lives together. You can see they're both considerably older. This would have been after their divorce and remarriage. And so there was something very, very strong tie there that, that really stimulated both of them through thick and thin. Now, the portrait on the left, the double portrait, we can almost think of as a marriage portrait, because it was painted not too long after their marriage, and it has a special relevance for us here in the Bay Area because it was painted in San Francisco, and it was during Frida's first voyage, first trip to America, where she joined Diego while he was painting murals in San Francisco. And so it, through various transfers and collectors and so forth, it now is in the permanent collection of the Museum of Modern Art, San Francisco. I'm hoping that it's also been lent to the show at the DeYoung. But in any case, it is in the permanent collection, and it's always on view in one of the SF MoMA galleries. Now, I mentioned that Frida and Diego had a very stormy, tumultuous, and loving relationship. And there was about an almost 2-year period where they divorced before they reconciled and remarried. And during that time when they were separated, this self-portrait that Frida painted is so eloquent. What did she do? She took the shears and cut all that long hair, which she used in these very artistic ways to create these amazing hairdos. And there she is, once again in men's clothing, but this time very bulky. It looks like she might have borrowed one of Diego's suits. It's very, very bulky and body concealing. And her hair is scattered all over the ground there. And so it really is a self-portrait about mourning, the sadness of and loss of that particular period. There were 2 accidents in my life, the bus accident and Diego. Here we have another view of that relationship in the painting on the right, which incidentally was done later after their divorce and remarriage. Here you see Frida, this time with her hair down, her long hair, regrown, holding Diego like a baby. So take a look at that. And Diego has a third eye. It's kind of hard to see in the scale of this picture, but in his forehead, that is the third eye of spiritual ascendance, of wisdom, what have you. I'll have a little more to say about the fascinating background of this painting a little bit later. Right now, we're focusing on the relationship between Frida and Diego and how that impacted her art. And here you can see in a little bit larger scale what's going on in this picture. So as I mentioned earlier, they did get remarried in San Francisco in, let's see, it was 1940. Let me move this a little bit. Yeah, 1940. So she would have been in her 30s at that time. And so it's quite interesting that the marriage portrait, which was painted in San Francisco, sort of is kind of bookended by this photograph on the right-hand side, documenting their remarriage, probably the justice of the peace, in San Francisco. And please notice her fabulous costume that she has here. Probably bought in Chinatown. If not the costume itself, then the fabric, but she could very well have found a costume like this, a traditional costume like this in Chinatown. She loved Chinatown for all the reasons that you might suppose: the brilliant, bright colors, the exotic designs of the old-fashioned clothes, the traditional clothes, the jewelry, and other accessories of that sort. So in this case, the remarriage is kind of a solemn, let's get it done kind of event. It's not like a joyous kind of a celebration that we might imagine for the marriage itself. So now I want to talk about yet another element of Frida's construction of herself. Frida as both Mexican and as Mixtec. This is a painting that she did in the 1930s, late 1930s. And it's like a genealogical tree. And so first of all, you have the little Frida here, standing in the courtyard of the so-called Blue House, or the Casa Azul, where she lived for a significant part of her life. It was the family house where she grew up, and she also lived there as an adult. And so you see Frida here as a little girl, and also as a fetus, more or less in the belly of her mother. Her mother was Mexican, and her father was an immigrant from Eastern Europe. So isn't that an American story? By that I mean all the Americas, of joining up the immigrants with the populations that already were here. And notice that the very Victorian looking dress of her mother, let's say it would have been around 1900 when they were married. And the father was a very successful photographer. That was his business, and he made a good living for his family. So then you have on our right-hand side, his parents, European, obviously, Hungarian, with his mutton chops, mustaches there, and his mother, Frida's grandmother, and then her mother's parents that you see here, especially her grandfather, looks particularly Mexican, in perhaps Hispanic and Indian as well. And so all of this is joined together with these ribbons, which she holds in her hand. So she was Mixtec and very proud of it. She did not shy away from that, even though she really claimed the Mexican identity, which one could argue is mixed, just like the North American identity is very sort of mixed up. But she really played the Mexican card very strongly in what she was drawn to, the activities in her life, and the way she lived her life. And this painting by Frida Kahlo tells another part of that story. You have this, what looks like a very ancient mother figure with a face that looks like some kind of statue or stone-like face, but the body very soft and nourishing. So Frida is suggesting here, of course, Frida is a little girl, but as an adult as well, being nourished and fed and held by this Mexican mama, with the background of the forests and the trees and so forth. And I will have more to say a little bit later about the importance of nature for Frida, the way it nourished her and the way it informed her paintings. Well, we've seen this painting before. It was done in 1939. And this was also done during the time that she and Diego were separated. And here she's really exploring those two identities that really were dear to her. It's not like she shunned the European identity, because these two figures are very linked. They hold hands. On the left is the, shall we say, the bourgeois Frida in a old-fashioned kind of costume, not unlike the wedding dress of her mother that we saw just a few slides ago. And then on the right, the Tijuana type of costume, which was her more common everyday kind of dress, much simpler, but also with the voluminous skirts that would hide her disabled legs, and the very loose-fitting top that would really disguise the various girdles and prosthetic devices that she had to wear most of the time. So the hands are linked. So there's a partnership not only of the hearts, but also of the hearts here, linked together by this blood vessel. But then we see here the more bourgeois Frida on the left, more European Frida, tying off this blood-stained with the surgical calipers, which she would know very well, incidentally, because she had so many medical procedures, operations, surgeries throughout her life to try to correct the various disabilities that she experienced. This is quite a large painting. It's one of the largest paintings that she did. Her self-portraits tend to be more intimate. I have a photo showing you the scale of it that will come up in a few moments. And another way in which she expressed her interest in traditional Mexican culture and ancient culture are through a collection of artifacts. And this is something that she and Diego passionately shared. Diego, I should say, this is a sidebar. Diego, by and large, earned pretty good money with all his mural commissions that took him not only out of Mexico, but also to Europe and North America. So he collected good money, which he then didn't really know very much. He had no interest in taking care of his money. So Frida became the person who was really the comptroller in the family, which allowed taking care of the money allowed them to become serious collectors of Mexican antiquities, probably at a better price than what they would fetch today. But you're seeing on the left is one room in the Casa Azul, which many of you may know is now a museum open to the public. And you see some of the antiquities lined up on the wall, as well as a more contemporary ceramics and folk art. And this is one of the ancient statues that was in one of the outside nooks at the Casa Azul, just to give you a flavor of the kinds of antiquities that they collected very assiduously, both of them. And here are two pictures of the Casa Azul. Some of you may have even visited the Blue House, the Casa Azul, in Coyoacán, sorry for the stumble, which is a suburb of Mexico City. You see the courtyard on the right and a street view on the left-hand side. So they were also, or I should say Frida especially, interested in the folk art of Mexico. And I'm showing you two examples. There could be so many others. And some of these motifs, even though she wasn't specifically religious in a sense of being Catholic or what have you, she was fascinated with these remembrances. You see a painting of a man holding up a sheet with this emblazoned picture of the Madonna in the center. That's what you're looking at here. And on the right, various saints and angels up in the clouds, holding up the 5 fingers of this hand here. Very often all these sheep sort of looking on. Very often these were painted as mementos or remembrances of somebody who died, very often in an accident or accidental kind of way. And so she collected those, and we see some of those motifs showing up in some of her paintings. And finally, in this section of my talk where I want to talk about the various ways in which she constructed her public identity, one has to talk about Frida as a political activist. Both she and Diego were very strongly left-wing, and this is a very early photograph showing both of them, excuse me for going forward too fast, showing them at the head of a march that is fighting for the painters and the sculptors of Mexico. And of course, the painters being especially the great muralist painters, including Diego here in the center there. And interestingly enough, she's dressed in a more conventional European style dress here without the long full skirts. And as we saw earlier, she was very proud of her association with the Communist Party. Here she's lifted up her ribos, the blouse that she was wearing, in order to display the girdle that she wears underneath, the plaster of Paris girdle with the hammer and sickle very prominently painted there. And of course, you remember, she painted those. And Diego included her in one of his murals here. Here is Frida in the center there with the symbolic red blouse on. And then, of course, the hammer and sickle here, in case you had any doubt about the allegiance of these workers in this mural. Not only were Diego and Frida communists, but they took their activism to an extreme, you might say. On the left-hand side of the photograph, you see Diego in the center, of course, and on the left is Leon Trotsky. Now, you may remember that Leon Trotsky, of course, he was one of the original Russian communists, but he was ousted very bitterly from the party, and Stalin really had it in for him. And so he was chased all over Europe trying to find asylum, one country and another, but the governments generally were afraid to keep him for fear of retaliations from the Soviet Union. And so he was moving in different places in Europe and finally found asylum in Mexico. And Frida and Diego actually gave him asylum. He and his wife did not stay in their house, but they stayed in, actually it was the house of Frida's sister, Christina. So they were very much responsible for the Trotsky couple. Well, not only did Frida welcome Trotsky, and as did Diego, but she had an affair with him. And she had many affairs throughout her life. And of course, that was one of the bones of contention between them, because both of them had all kinds of affairs. And Diego at one point even had an affair with Frida's sister, Christina. So there was a lot of hanky-panky going on throughout their married life together that was not on the conjugal bed. And so on the right side, you see a portrait, self-portrait, which is dedicated to Leon Trotsky. Nothing like making a public statement of her allegiance to Trotsky. And once again, she is dressed in traditional dress, here with the long skirt and with the traditional rebozo, and then with a scroll here, making it very specific of the dedication to Trotsky. As you probably know, things did not turn out well with Trotsky, and there were several attempts on his life, each one more ugly than the last. And finally, one of the Russian assassins managed to cave in his brain with a sledgehammer. And so that was the end of that particular story, but they still, both of them were still very avid communists. But the thing that puzzles me particularly is that Frida was quite loyal to Stalin later in her life, considering that Stalin was by then known as a very oppressive dictator and had assassinated her lover, Trotsky. She nevertheless was very loyal to Stalin, which shows up in various paintings that she did. And even at her funeral, you see the cortege here with her casket, her open casket, I might say, with the hammer and sickle there. And you can see here Diego looking very, very aged, and of course, very sad in mourning. So that was in 1954. So now we want to take a closer look at the paintings themselves. So far, the paintings that I've shown you by Frida Kahlo were really illustration. I used them to illustrate various points I was making about her life, her thoughts, her attitudes, and so forth. But now let's look a little closer at the paintings themselves. And we'll come back to this photograph, but this time we're going to talk about this fellow here on the right side of that photograph. And that's André Breton. Now, André Breton was the self-appointed leader of the French Surrealist group, of course, located in Paris. He was a writer, a poet. He was not a visual artist himself, but he gathered around him many visual artists. And he himself was in Mexico, obviously, since he's with the same time that Trotsky was around. And he loved Frida's work. He said, oh, Frida is a surrealist. That was, of course, his way of giving the best compliment, that she was a surrealist. Well, Frida really took issue with that. She said, I'm not a surrealist. You surrealists think about your dreams and your fantasies, and you smoke the hash pipe, and then you go off and dream your dreams. I paint what is very real for me. And I'm bringing back this scene of her miscarriage as a good illustration of that very point. The title of this work is The Henry Ford Hospital, and it was painted in 1932, you see there. So she would have been still in her 20s, and probably this would have been her second visit to, with Diego, of course, to North America. First one was in San Francisco, and this time she was in Detroit. That's the Henry Ford Hospital, because Diego was working on one of his very well-known commissions, that is to say the fresco murals in the Detroit Institute of Arts. A little sidebar there, one of my first jobs out of college was in the education department at the Detroit Institute of Arts, and so that was, those frescoes were certainly a very important part of my growing up time, of being surrounded with these amazing frescoes. So that's just a sidebar. So Frida was along for the ride, and she was pregnant, but was not able to carry the child. And so that's what's being sort of mapped out in this, what we can call also a self-portrait, with this poor child floating up in midair, this snail-like a character also connected by one of these veins or vessels. And then a reference to her injured and broken pelvis that made it so difficult for her to actually carry a child. She obviously could get pregnant, but then couldn't carry the child. And in the background, you see, very distant background, you see all the sort of machinery of early technology. Interestingly enough, Diego was much more fascinated in a positive way with American machinery, technology, and so forth. So he must have been in pig heaven in Detroit because it's all about cars and manufacturing and so forth. Frida, not so much. But you see as a sort of a distant backdrop to this tragedy here, some of the machinery and water towers and so forth that dotted the Detroit landscape at that time. So here's another example of what was real to her. Remember her saying, coming back at Andre Breton and saying, I'm not a surrealist. What I paint is very real. And incidentally, that did not stop her from accepting Andre Breton's invitation to come to Paris and to have a one-artist show in one of the galleries there, which she did do in 1938. And this particular painting, What the Water Gave Me, was probably included in that exhibition. So here you see her. It's, first of all, you can imagine it as a Frida perspective. She's lying in the bathtub with her toes just barely poking out of the water, and you'll notice the right foot is somewhat wounded. Again, a reference to all the problems that she was having with not only with the foot but with the whole leg. And then there's various motifs from many of her paintings. For example, her parents. You see her mother there and her father with a distinctive handlebar mustache. And you see this paint, a little fragment from a painting which we'll look at very soon. I love this volcano here with the Empire State Building kind of bursting out of it, a reference to her experiences in North America. And one of her dresses sort of floating along the top there. So what the water gave her, what we can surmise, I think, from this particular portrayal, which is another kind of self-portrait, is, first of all, she probably spent time in the bathtub, like a spa treatment to ease some of her pains. And so out of that easement and that relaxation could come some of these memories and some of these visions of what her life was really like, both in Mexico as well as in North America. That is to say, her visits to the United States. And we come back to the two Fridas. Looking at it a little bit closer, before we saw that we were looking at two different personalities, both Fridas. And she really put a lot of importance in this painting because, as I mentioned earlier, this is one of the largest paintings that she did. And I have a photograph here to show you, give you a sense of the scale of this picture. I do not know whether this painting is in the DeYoung exhibition. Time will tell whether we'll get to see the painting itself. I want to point out that even when she's in the studio with her messy palette and so forth, she's still completely, perfectly put together with a beautiful Mexican top and her beautiful earrings and this elaborate hairdress and decorations, flowers and so forth, that would have taken a good piece of time to put together each morning. So her toilette, her personal toilette, was clearly always very important to her. And let's come back once again to the self-portrait with cropped hair. When we compare this, the painting style, with that early double portrait with Diego and his new bride, which was done in a deliberately sort of primitivizing style, we can see that her method of painting has developed considerably. There's a much finer sense of modeling in the volumes of the figure itself and the modeling of the suit that this very ill-fitting suit that she's wearing, and this very kind of sad but beautifully put together face. So even in her sadness and her feeling her sense of aloneness, being separated from Diego. She finds a way to present herself as Frida, not as a lost soul, but somebody who somehow, even though seated, is standing strong. And of course, that led very quickly, or after about 1.5 years, to their remarriage in San Francisco, as I've mentioned earlier. So let's take a look at these two paintings. We've seen the one on the left before, and actually both of them have a similar title, My Nanny and I. The one on the right comes with 2 different titles. So we've seen the one on the left where Frida acknowledges where she gets her sustenance. Is not only from this ancient Earth Mother, rooted in Mexican culture, in Mexican soil, in the Mexican jungle, but also in this painting on the right, which is done just 2 years later, so they're pretty close together. Here you see these 2 figures, and you remember I was in the painting, What the Water Gave Me, I pointed to this motif, something that we would see later. These 2 women cuddling together, which she included in the bathtub scene. And there's a very, very strange kind of jungle going on in the background. But first, let's look at these 2 figures. We probably want to take them as lovers. So it's a different relationship than what we see with this Earth Mother. And yet the woman on the right is a dark-skinned woman, presumably Mexican or in any case, a darker-skinned Indian type. And this is the Frida figure. She was known to have lesbian relationships. So she was very bisexual in her own way. And this is very likely a reference to one of those relationships she had. So here, instead of it being the Earth Mother nourishing her and breastfeeding her, it's another kind of loving and embrace and support given to Frida by this, what we take to be an indigenous person, a woman. And then this fantastical forest. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the early 20th century painter in Paris called Henri Rousseau, who was a self-taught painter, he also painted jungles that look sort of like this, where, excuse me, one leaf is enlarged to fill a whole space rather than being just a sort of a normal sized leaf. And so there's this improbable looking jungle that rears behind these 2 lovers. And then peeking out of that, look very carefully, and you see this monkey. He's sort of witnessing, sort of peeking out of the leaves and witnessing these 2 lovers together. Now, what's true is that Frida had pet monkeys most of her adult life. And so we can imagine that this is one of her pet monkeys sort of looking in on the scene. So I mentioned earlier that the Frida's relationship to the natural world was a very strong one, and we see it, of course, from in this nursing picture, but also here. And anytime we see a natural landscape or background in any of her pictures, self-portraits or otherwise, we know that that is part of the meaning and part of the message of the picture. So on the one hand, you have this very fertile kind of jungle-like background. But we also see this kind of desert-like background. No plants there, it's just sort of brown earth stretching off to the horizon. So there's something of a contrast there. And to make us really aware of this living forest here, we see the roots that presumably extend down X-ray vision style into the ground. So let's come back to this painting that we saw earlier, where Frida is sort of babying her Diego, the love embrace of the universe, or sometimes referred to as the earth, done in 1940. So she would have been in her 30s at that time, but they had been married for probably about 10 years at that time, a little more. So what we pointed out before was that Frida, of course, is holding Diego, and with the third eye very prominent in his forehead. But then in turn, Frida is being held by this mother, this earth mother creature, which is similar to the earth mother we just looked at. But then there's yet another holding, and that is this figure here, which is both dark and light. And the way that I interpret it is going back to the mystic sense that Frida had of her own identity, the indigenous, the darker skinned, coming around to this dark hand, holding the roots, again, a symbol which symbolizes the life. And of course, the complete surround of this cactus garden that surrounds the whole central motif. And then on our right is this whiter skinned woman that also completes the embrace, coming around with this lighter skinned hand, which holds together with the dark skinned hand. And then with these, what are they? Moons, planets, some kind of celestial event here. But it's interesting that both the dark and the light earth mothers, sky mothers, if you will, sort of blend off into the sky itself. So it's a very rich painting in terms of its iconography and how she set it up with these layers. Here's another example of how she really used natural plants and so forth as part of her message. The Roots of the Pedregal from 1943, about the same time, just a little bit later than the painting we just looked at. On the one hand, the landscape is kind of barren, isn't it? It has more features in it than the earth painting we saw a couple of slides ago. But then that makes quite a contrast with what Frida herself is growing out of her body. All of these leaves and vines that encircle her and wrap her, hopefully give comfort to her. Well, I have to say a few more words about Frida's attitudes and thoughts and feelings about North America, that is to say, the United States, since she traveled there to North America many times, more often than not in the company of Diego, but not always. One of her longest term love affairs was with a photographer by the name of Murray. And so she would visit him and meet up with him in New York City. So that's just a little sidebar to mention here. So I'm going to show you two paintings which give you sort of different views of her attitudes towards America. So here we have the self-portrait on the border between Mexico and the United States. So this would have been close to the first time that she came to the United States, the time that she did that double marriage, what I call the marriage portrait with herself, with Diego. Here she is dressed in again, in a long frilly dress, but a more feminine kind of dress, not so much the Tijuana indigenous kind of costume, but always with those long full skirts. So she's standing at the border between Mexico, which is quite obviously on our left, and America, which is represented on the right-hand side. And she's carrying, of course, the Mexican flag in her hand. So what do we see here? We see ancient Mexican ruins. We see the moon and the sun blazing down from the sky, both of them. Ancient suggestion of ancient ruins, and of course some of the artifacts from the ancient cultures scattered on the ground. And then this whole kind of, I would call it something like a garden on the bottom to suggest the fruitfulness and the liveliness of Mexican culture and Mexico itself, as we've already suggested in the earlier slides that I've just shown you. And then on our right, we see all these mechanical devices and the smokestacks steaming out great billows of smoke, which today we think of, oh my dear, this poisoning the atmosphere. And everything very geometrical and rigid and right angle, and with no sense of history. I mean, here we have this very deep history represented in the Mexican side, and everything new and shiny and metallic and machine made, America on the right-hand side. So I think we can imagine that Frida takes a rather dim view. And as I mentioned earlier, she had a much dimmer view of the whole factory culture of North America, much more than Diego, who thought, oh, this is going to be what will really create a whole new society for us. He was very taken with American technology. The following year, when she visited once again, she's in New York this time, and the title of this painting is "My Dress Hangs Here." Well, now you can see the dress in the middle, of course, this clothesline here, which is much more of the referencing the Tijuana, the indigenous kind of costume, than the cute, fluffy pink dress in the slide we just looked at. But it's an empty dress. It's like Frida's not here. Frida herself has vacated. At least that's one way to read this particular painting. And so we're surrounded once again with these high-rise structures, the Statue of Liberty way up there, and the lower part of Manhattan, which already sported many high skyscrapers. And one of the features that I absolutely love was this larger-than-life toilet standing on this Doric column that you see here on the left. Well, probably all of you know that Americans are the butt of many jokes from our friends, not only to the South, but also in Europe, of how obsessed we are with plumbing. And of course, yes, we like our flush toilets. And of course, that's come home to roost only in the last few months, where the big obsession was getting enough toilet paper, as many people hoarded their toilet paper during the coronavirus lockdown. So it's evidently a cultural attitude, which is still very much with us, and which Frida had enjoyed mocking in this particular painting. But look at some of the other motifs here. We see all this throwaway garbage here, certainly another aspect of American culture, which is very much with us. And then this kind of fire coming out of a bucket on the left-hand side. And then what I take to be Mae West, you know, the Hollywood glamour and so forth, in this big screen or poster that we see on the left side. So that's where her dress hangs here, but she has absented herself in a personal and spiritual kind of way. Here we're looking at two different self-portraits where she used that traditional Tehuana dress in an unusual kind of way. The portrait on the left we've already seen, 1948. I haven't shown this to you before, but she was using a similar kind of costume. And what she's actually done here is take the skirt of that costume and made a headdress out of it, so that it's completely disguising the contours of her body. And you'll notice that the third, instead of the third eye, is a portrait of Diego. And always, almost always, with these extraordinarily elaborate hairdos with beautiful flowers and ribbons and so forth that are braided into the hair, something that she created anew every single day. And indeed, these self-portraits that are very closely cropped, not showing the body, but the head and shoulders, that is really her signature format in so much of her work. And I'm hoping that there'll be a good selection of those self-portraits in the DeYoung exhibition. So let's look a little bit closer at the broken column, which we saw earlier, and in a larger format, so you can really see what's going on here with this broken column, which expresses so graphically the experience, her own personal subjective experience of her wounds, her pain from that early accident that have caused innumerable operations and surgeries and other kinds of medical interventions. She had a whole team of doctors, both in the United States as well as in Mexico, that were continuously attending her. So 1944. So the broken column, that's one part of the iconography. And then the tears. And then these nails that really, the biggest one, the biggest nail pricking her heart on the left side. Now she took a clue from a much earlier painting, which we know she was very fond of. And that was the martyrdom of Saint Sebastian by the Renaissance painter Mantegna. So she's taken several things from this standard iconography of Saint Sebastian, who is shown being martyred and killed by these arrows. You remember he was the soldier who was at the crucifixion, who converted on the spot and saw the light of the Christ, and he was martyred for that. That's the brief story. So what Frida has taken is not only the idea of the column. So we have the classical column, which now is internalized inside of her, rather than being exterior. In the Mantegna, the column would be a suggestion or reference to the fact that the classical world was decomposing and falling apart, because you see the column here as a ruin. She's put it to a different purpose here as referencing something very particular and personal in her own body. And then the arrows that plunge into his flesh every which way, she has transferred into nails be piercing her skin at various points. So she was no slouch in taking classical iconography from earlier paintings, in this case the Renaissance, and putting them to her own personal use. So I'll conclude this talk with just a very brief nod to the way in which Frida has become this superstar, where it seems like as a culture we cannot get enough of Frida. And so, as many of you might be aware, there's a certain sense of Frida mania, having to have everything Frida. So we see, for example, high-rises that with paint Frida reproductions on them. And then there's a whole side of an apartment building somewhere in Hungary that has a painting showing a self-portrait of Frida Kahlo. So these windows give you a sense of the scale of this mural painting, honoring or celebrating Frida Kahlo. And even this gift shop that has just every different kind of little memento, including some Christian crosses and so forth, self-portraits and other doodads associated with Frida. But let's not forget that the Frida herself was a very strong, determined, focused woman. I'm showing you here with that pet monkey that was peeking out of the jungle in the love scene with her female lover. But here he's embracing, the monkey is embracing her. So let's leave with that sense of our Frida, being an indomitable woman who really created a life for herself and very seldom let her pain, her disabilities, slow her down. Thank you so much for your attention here. And I hope that we meet again, maybe in the halls of the exhibition at the DeYoung Museum. Bye-bye for now.